Alright guys, this is our second video on the Korean War. We're going to finish up. To quickly review from last video, we saw the North Korean invasion in 1950 of South Korea with the goal of unifying the entire peninsula under communism. The United Nations, helped tremendously by America and other allies, are going to send forces to South Korea to defend that country and then push the North Koreans back into the country. And where we left off in the last video, UN forces had approached very close to the Yalu River. And the Yalu River is the dividing line between North Korea and China. And as we talked about, China was a communist country at this point, and China felt threatened by this presence of American and UN forces so close to its border, and they're going to get involved in this in a big, big way. So let's talk a little bit about that Chinese intervention and then what happens post-intervention. So in October 1950, China sends about 300,000 soldiers across the border into North Korea. Now, these soldiers were all volunteers. You know, they were all there to help the communist movement across the world and all that. These were all communist patriots. We were told. Of course, these are just peasants who are conscripted in the Chinese Communist Army. They don't have a choice, but here they are invading. And 300,000 soldiers that's a lot, right? And they're going to come across the border, really catching us by surprise. They kind of almost materialized almost out of nowhere, and they push us back down the peninsula. And by January 1951, in fact, we had been pushed out of North Korea. So if you look down here, it's as far as Chinese-North Korean advance. So to quickly summarize the war, the North Koreans had started up here, they attacked south, then they were pushed back, and then the Chinese came back in and pushed the UN back down to here. Now, one of the tactics the Chinese had in their disposal and why they were so successful is just their sheer numbers. They would launch what are known as human wave attacks, where they would literally just come by the thousands charging at our soldiers. And there were so many of them that we would be overwhelmed and forced to retreat. Now, this is the Cold War, right? This is the 1950s. We have nuclear weapons in our arsenal. And the question that you might be asking yourself is, well, why didn't we just use them? And this is something that Douglas MacArthur had certainly petitioned. We should be using these against China and North Korea to end this war. But Truman decides that that's not the best strategy. To start nuking North Korea and China would be just an astounding escalation of the war. And of course, the real danger is it would bring the Soviet Union into the war. They were a nuclear power. And in fact, what could happen is World War III could break out. And so we don't want a World War III. And so Douglas MacArthur is basically, saying, hey, let's expand this war. Let's start attacking China. And Truman says no. MacArthur continues his campaign of criticizing Truman behind his back, but also publicly. And, think about the chain of command. Douglas MacArthur might have 5 stars as in the highest ranking general there is, but he's still subordinate to the commander-in-chief. That's Harry Truman. And he's being insubordinate. And so eventually Truman fires him and basically kicks him out and said, you're done. Now, what's going to happen between the Chinese, pushing the UN forces back down and the end of the war is basically a stalemate breaks out. Neither side are committing to full-scale war in the sense that this is not World War II level where, we're going to field an army of millions or something like that. Neither side can really push the other side out of where we're at. And everything begins to bog down, and it starts to resemble almost World War I, where you have trenches, you have attacks that don't accomplish much, bodies being piled up, people's patience begins to run low on why this war is still going on. And the war becomes increasingly unpopular. So by July of 1953, this is 3 years after the war began, the UN forces in North Korea and Chinese forces agree to a ceasefire. Okay, not a peace treaty, a ceasefire or armistice. We've used that word before. And the ceasefire said that the two Koreas would have a new border. Okay, and that new border would be this dark line right here. So the original border, before the war began, it was right here, the 38th parallel. This is the new border. So not really a whole lot changed in terms of territory gained and lost. So this begs the question, did we win the Korean War or did we lose the Korean War? And it really depends on how you measure our success. And that's what we're going to look at right now. This is the Korean War Memorial in Washington, D.C. I've never been there, but it looks very interesting. You've got these sort of statues of American soldiers marching into battle, or at least around Korea somewhere. And the faces, they kind of tell you how these soldiers are feeling. This is a long, brutal, tiring war. So by the end of the war, some 4 million people are dead. And a good chunk of those are civilians. And the biggest chunk, of course, are Koreans themselves. Koreans are going to die in just ridiculous numbers during the Korean War. American losses are about 36,000, 36,500 or so, which compared to World War II is small, not even a tenth of what we lost in World War II. But it's still a lot of soldiers. That's still a lot of lives that were disrupted here in America because of this war. So again, did we win? Did we lose? Well, we stopped the North Korean invasion of South Korea. We stopped the spread of communism. That's a victory. But you could also say it wasn't a full victory because we didn't stop the threat of a communist invasion, right? North Korea continued to exist after this war was over. And in fact, today, the two Koreas, North and South, are divided by what's known as a demilitarized zone, or DMZ. This is a very, very tense area. It's probably the tensest border on planet Earth. Basically, this 2.5 mile wide strip is demilitarized. Neither side are allowed to put military equipment there. This will, in theory, prevent a future war by not having armies so close to one another that a war breaks out accidentally. Either side of the DMZ, however, is heavily fortified. Landmines, barbed wire, thousands and thousands and thousands of soldiers, and they've been there since the end of the war. So basically from 1953 on, always worried about that next war that could happen. Now, even though the border, that DMZ, is about 2.5 miles wide, there is one place on the DMZ where the two sides can actually come and meet. And at this place, Panmunjom, you'll notice the DMZ is not 2.5 miles wide. It is literally this concrete barrier right here. This is the border. Okay, this is the North Korean side. That is the South Korean side. And the two sides have spent decades basically staring each other down. It sounds almost comical. It's so ridiculous, but that's what they've been doing. It's a very, very tense area. Not only do you see the border here, but if you were to go inside those buildings, the buildings themselves are divided. There's literally like a conference table that's divided, and half the table is North Korea, half the table is in South Korea. That's where they can sit down and negotiate and talk if they need to. So let's think about these two Koreas post-war. Which one's going to be more successful in the long run? And well, North Korea has not been very successful. I mean, they may have survived the Korean War, but it's that was kind of their highlight. Since the Korean War, it's been a pretty backwards, repressive place. The founder of North Korea, Kim Il-sung, ruled the country with an iron fist until his death in 1994. And you can see this giant statue of him in Pyongyang, which is the capital of North Korea. And when he died, well, we'll get to him in a second, but first I wanted to show you this, some of this propaganda. There's Kim Il-sung, there's Kim Il-sung. What this is it's called the mass games, and this is something the North Koreans put on an annual basis. They put these huge displays on. It's all choreographed. They practice for the whole year, and then they put on this big ceremony. And this picture you see behind us, and you can see it here, it's literally made up of people holding these books of different colors. And they can like turn the page and show a different color to form a new image. They're almost like pixels on a TV screen. And if you ever go on YouTube and look up mass games North Korea, they're pretty elaborate. Here's a closer view of one of those. You can see the people here. So, as I said, Kim Il-sung dies in 1994. He is replaced by his son, Kim Jong Il, who, like his father, was repressive, brutal, killed thousands of his people, put thousands and thousands of his people in work camps, basically like gulags we saw in the Soviet Union. severe economic problems under this guy's reign. There were a series of droughts and famines where the economy just completely collapsed, and there were people starving to death in North Korea. But North Korea, under his leadership, did develop nuclear weapons. And for North Korea, nuclear weapons are basically their get out of jail free card, right? Is the ultimate response to the rest of the world, that no one will dare mess with North Korea. And by North Korea, I really mean the Kim family, as long as they have nuclear weapons. So for them, it's like the ultimate bulletproof vest, right? Nothing can stop us if we have nuclear weapons, and we will never give those weapons up. I don't see North Korea ever truly giving up their nuclear weapons. Here we are looking at North Korean mass parade. North Korea likes to provoke the world by launching missiles, tests and so forth, to show off their strength. And their missile technology is quickly advancing. You can see some of the different missile types that they have and the ranges of them and the tests that they have done. Their missiles, in theory, could reach the United States. When Kim Jong Il died, there was a bit of confusion who would take over next, and who took over was his son, the current leader of North Korea. And we'll look at him in just one moment. First, a couple of images from Kim Jong Il's funeral, and these images of North Koreans just falling all over themselves to cry and to panic that their dear leader has died. How much of this is real? How much of this is the result of brainwashing? How much of this is people feeling compelled to act sad just so they don't get punished? Who knows? North Korea is a very isolated society. It's hard for us to really penetrate and understand what's in their minds. But here is who took over, Kim Jong-un. There's a lot of sort of mystery surrounding this guy. We don't know a whole lot about him, especially when he took over. He was almost an unknown. But he's run the country since. He is a brutal, from all evidence we have anyways, a brutal dictator, one who is not afraid at all of killing many of his own people and imprisoning his own people and using nuclear weapons to gain leverage over the rest of the world. And he's also a young man, so he'll be ruling North Korea unless something happens for probably a long, long time. All right, so North Korea has gone down the road of repression and communism and all that stuff. What about South Korea? Well, South Korea was also a repressive society up until about 1987. In 1987, things really opened up in South Korea. It became far more democratic, far more prosperous, and they have spent the last almost 4 decades since that time growing economically just tremendously, right? The two Koreas could not be more different today. One is prosperous and outgoing and connected to the rest of the world. The other one is isolated, almost like a hermit, kind of stuck in the past. And if you ever want to know the difference between the two Koreas, all you have to do is look at the two Koreas at night from a satellite. Okay, so here's South Korea, all lit up at night. There's Seoul, the capital city. And then there's North Korea. It's in the dark, except for its capital and a few little outposts here and there. So this really tells you just how economically advanced South Korea is and how economically behind North Korea is. There are some companies out there that you may not even realize are South Korean, and I think this speaks to their technology level. Hyundai, for example, is South Korean. Kia is South Korean. LG, so if you have an LG product at home, that's a South Korean product. The biggest one, though, and I know you've all heard of this one, Samsung. Some of us have a Samsung phone like sitting right next to you or probably in your hand right now, and that is a South Korean product. They don't make a lot of cell phones in North Korea, and there's a reason why. Okay, they're way behind South Korea. So that was just a quick summary of the Korean War. Again, the war is sometimes known as the Forgotten War because it's so overlooked between World War II and the Vietnam War, but it's a very important example of how containment actually worked in the Cold War, that America was willing to fight and sacrifice to contain the spread of communism. And there are lots of long-term legacies that we're still dealing with. One of which I forgot to mention, when the armistice went into effect in 1953 to end the fighting of the Korean War, there was no permanent peace treaty signed at that time. In fact, there has not been a permanent peace treaty Okay, let that sink in for a second. The Korean War, technically speaking, is still on because there was never a formal peace treaty. There's been talk about doing this. It's never gotten anywhere. Who knows? Maybe they will eventually put these things away, but my guess is the Korean War will just continue and continue and continue. All right, that is it for the Korean War, guys. And we'll move on to our next topic in the Cold War in the next segment.